We all love a classic, and the older I get, I remember my dad saying he would prefer the older car, not so lowered, not modified, just classic, as it was designed, clean, and well looked after. I feel his sentiment. After just selling a stunning 1975 Mercedes 450 SE, I capture myself in that same ideal. What happened to those cars that were perfect off the line, no extras needed? They were built for the everyday person. Attainable, but far from flawless. Fun to drive and easy to work on, sure. But let's be honest, they were mostly parts bin specials. They couldn't compete with what was coming out of Japan. So when Japanese manufacturers started rolling out their own sports cars, ones that were faster, better built, and more reliable, the British car industry started to fall away. Now, while the 60s were beautiful in their own right, there's another decade I think deserves a closer look. A decade where every corner of the market, from family sedans to track monsters, was thriving. In my opinion, this was when car culture peaked. I'm talking about the 1990s. The 90s was just a great time to be alive, and a fantastic time to be into cars. It was the decade of Friends, Titanic, Die Hard with a Vengeance, the end of the Cold War, and the birth of the internet. The 70s and 80s had been tough on automakers. Safety and emissions regulations tightened, pushing manufacturers to innovate or die. But by the 90s, those growing pains were mostly over. Fuel injection, turbochargers, and reliable electronics had matured. The 90s became a middle ground between the analog beauty of classic cars and the digital overload we see today. And reliability? It was booming, especially if we're talking about Honda and Toyota. This was the decade they became household names, not just because of clever marketing, but because they were over-engineering their cars. A well-maintained Camry or Civic could easily hit 300,000 miles. Hell, even the beaters could go the distance. And here's the kicker, they were still simple. No iPads glued to dashboards, just solid materials, mechanical dials, and enough features to make driving enjoyable without feeling like you needed a computer science degree. It wasn't just the sedans either. This was the golden era of Japanese sports cars. The Honda or Acura NSX kicked things off. Mazda gave us the Miata and RX-7. Mitsubishi had the tech-loaded 3000 GT. Toyota delivered the legendary Supra. And of course, Nissan had the Skyline GTR. These cars weren't just quick, they had soul. They weren't necessarily profit machines, but they showed the world what Japan was capable of. And it wasn't just Japan flexing. Over in the US, muscle cars made a real comeback. Ford gave us the upgraded Mustang and the Cobra. GM brought out the 4th-gen Camaro and Firebird, faster, more aggressive, and finally usable as daily drivers. Without this era, muscle cars might have disappeared altogether. Germany was doing its thing too. Porsche was weathering a rough patch, but managed to release icons like the 993 and the Boxster. Exotic legends like the McLaren F1 and Ferrari F50 also came out of this decade. It was nuts. The best part, these sports cars still felt raw. No lane assist, no auto braking, no fake engine noise, just you, the machine, and the road. But it wasn't just about speed. Let's talk trucks. The 90s was the last great era of the practical pickup. You had square-body Fords, the beautifully executed Chevy CK series, and even performance trucks that could hang with sports cars from 0 to 60. Trucks came in every shape, size, and trim level imaginable. Convertible truck? Sure. Fast truck? Got it. Affordable? Definitely. They were still made for work, but were fun, customizable, and built to last. Visibility was great, maintenance was simple, and they didn't all look like angry toasters. And SUVs? Same deal. You had huge Suburbans built like tanks and tiny, capable off-roaders like the Suzuki Samurai. Minivans? You could choose anything from giant luxury cruisers to practical family boxes. Even luxury cars peaked in the 90s. The Lexus LS400 and Mercedes 500e were real-deal luxury, with actual thick leather and craftsmanship, not the fake-stitched plastic we see today. I once drove a late 90s Toyota Avalon while my modern VW was in the shop. That old Avalon felt more refined and better built than my brand new car. I couldn't believe it. This was also the era where luxury SUVs were born, where heated seats and dual-zone climate control started trickling down to the everyday car. Interiors were intuitive, unique, and beautiful. No cost-cutting iPads in sight. It felt like everything was made with the driver in mind. Design language was simpler too. Trucks didn't need fake vents and slashes. Cars just looked clean and purposeful. And sizes? Reasonable. You didn't need a tank to get groceries. Let's not forget safety. While crash tests have improved, overall traffic fatalities haven't dropped much since the late 90s. In fact, pedestrian deaths have nearly doubled. Why? Because we can't see out of these oversized blobs we drive today. Back then, visibility was better, distractions were fewer, and drivers actually drove. By the late 90s, we had everything: comfort, safety, reliability, analog feel, and evolving technology. It was a true sweet spot. Most modern safety tech? It's just compensating for the fact that today's cars are bloated and distracting. Backup cameras are great, but why do we need 5 of them just to park? Cars from the 90s had what mattered. Today, we've traded soul for screen time. So, what really happened after the 1990s? Why did we go from an era of driver-focused, reliable, affordable cars to the tech-heavy, bloated, over-engineered vehicles we see today? Well, it wasn't just one thing. It was a perfect storm of factors, ranging from regulatory shifts to global politics that reshaped the industry from the ground up. Let's break it down. 1. Regulation and emissions standards. By the late 90s and into the early 2000s, government-mandated emissions regulations became stricter across developed nations, especially in the US and EU. This wasn't a bad thing in theory. After all, cleaner air is a win, but the reality for car manufacturers was complicated. To meet these new targets, companies had to invest heavily in R&D for things like catalytic converters, EGR systems, DPFs, and eventually hybrid and electric drivetrains. This added significant cost to every vehicle built. And the irony? Light trucks, like pickups and large SUVs, were exempt from many of the regulations under the Corporate Average Fuel Economy (CAF) standards. Manufacturers quickly realized they could meet their fleet-wide efficiency goals and avoid fines by producing more light trucks, shifting entire product lineups away from sedans and wagons and into SUVs and utes. 2. Tariffs, trade agreements, and globalization. Throughout the 1990s, free trade agreements like NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, came into effect. While this created opportunity for parts manufacturing and vehicle assembly across borders, it also began eroding domestic car manufacturing in countries like the US, Australia, and the UK. In Australia, for example, import tariffs on foreign cars began to be dismantled through the 1990s and 2000s. This made imported Japanese, Korean, and later European and American vehicles much more competitive. Domestic car makers like Holden, Ford Australia, and Mitsubishi Australia couldn't compete on volume or price, especially when newer imports came with better features, higher quality standards, and more favorable warranties. This created a domino effect. Once you make imports cheaper, domestic production declines. When production declines, suppliers die off. And once the supply chain dries up, it's nearly impossible to bring it back. 3. Government subsidies and lack thereof. Governments around the world began selectively intervening in their automotive sectors. In the US, the 2008 financial crisis led to government bailouts of GM and Chrysler. In Europe, the EU supported car makers with incentives and environmental subsidies. Meanwhile, countries like China began pouring billions into state-supported automakers, many of which were developing EV technology years before the West caught on. But in Australia, the government eventually withdrew support. Despite the massive employment footprint of the automotive sector, subsidies dried up by the 2010s, and manufacturers were told to stand on their own feet in a globalized market. Holden closed its doors in 2017. Ford and Toyota followed. This marked the end of Australian car manufacturing. Number 4. Supply chain globalization. In the 1990s, automakers still maintained relatively local supply chains, but by the 2000s, this had shifted dramatically. Parts were being sourced globally, assembly lines were built where labor was cheapest, and platforms became standardized across multiple brands to reduce cost. While this was good for efficiency, it also meant that vehicles were increasingly designed for the global market, not local conditions. That's why you started seeing the same dashboards, the same infotainment systems, the same safety features in cars from Sydney to Seattle. It made cars cheaper to build, but more generic, more fragile, and less regionally appropriate. And when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, these global supply chains broke. Semiconductor shortages, shipping delays, and material scarcities exposed just how fragile this system really was, and prices soared as a result. Number 5. The rise of technology and its hidden cost. From the 2000s onwards, there was a seismic shift in vehicle design philosophy. Cars stopped being tools for driving and became platforms for software and infotainment. In came touchscreens, CAN bus networks, ECUs, and later OTA, over-the-air updates. The driving experience was no longer the priority. Connectivity was. But tech comes with overhead. Suddenly, car companies had to behave like Silicon Valley startups, competing not just on suspension tuning and engine design, but on UI/UX, app integration, cybersecurity, and data management. And here's the kicker, these features are also data gathering machines. Your vehicle now collects behavioral data that is often monetized, another source of profit that manufacturers didn't have in the 90s. 6. Rising prices and vanishing value. Back in the 90s, an average new car cost around $12,000 to $20,000, depending on the segment. Today, the average new car price in the US has crossed $48,000. In Australia, it's much the same. Good luck finding a new car under $35 that isn't built like a plastic lunchbox. Part of that is inflation. Part of it is tech and regulation. But a lot of it is simply profit maximization. By selling fewer higher-margin vehicles, especially SUVs and luxury trims, manufacturers make more while building less. It's why cheap, fun, durable small cars like the Toyota Echo, Ford Festiva, or Suzuki Swift Sport have all but disappeared. The entry-level buyer is now priced out. Young drivers have to buy second-hand or finance 6-plus-year loans on expensive SUVs they never wanted in the first place. Number 7. Cultural and political influence. Politics have always had an influence on the car market. From the oil shocks of the 70s to the Iraq War of the early 2000s, global instability pushes fuel prices, influences regulation, and even impacts what consumers want. For example, the wars in the Middle East and rising tensions with Russia and China pushed Western countries toward energy independence, which partially explains the rapid push toward electric vehicles. That transition is now being accelerated by policy rather than demand. Countries like Norway, Germany, and parts of the US have legislated bans on new combustion engine sales after certain dates. This has left manufacturers scrambling to meet political targets, often rushing tech to market before it's fully mature. So what's the end result? A car today is vastly more complex than it was in the 1990s. It's safer on paper, it's more connected, it's more fuel efficient. But is it better? Not always. Because the systems that built the cars of the 90s, robust supply chains, domestic manufacturing, mechanical simplicity, and reasonable regulation, have been replaced by a new system built on global logistics, corporate surveillance, and regulatory loopholes. The car of today might have cooled seats, 5 cameras, and a voice assistant, but it might also be heavier, more fragile, harder to fix, and more expensive than anything we've seen before. And sometimes, less is more.